Hi, Nick Huston here for Gotham Sound and Communications. Thanks for joining us today. We have an updated presentation on what's going on with the 600 megahertz band. We did a presentation last September where we learned quite a bit of things, and now we've taken all that information from September and some of the new information that we've gathered, and we've tried to condense it into hopefully what'll be less than 20 minutes. So without further ado, let's get started. So first, I just want to acknowledge that this presentation is a collection of information from so many different people. First and foremost, this was based on a presentation that Colleen Goodser from Zaxcom gave at the seminar we had back in September. Some of the things are literally copied and pasted from there, but we've had additional information provided by Peter Schneider from Gotham Sound, Howard Kaufman and Gordon Moore of Electrosonics, Ian McKelvey at Wisicom USA, Radioactive Designs, Henry Cohen of CP Communications, Ben Escobedo of Shure, and Sennheiser. All right, so first of all, what is the broadcast incentive auction? For people that have not heard about this, in March of 2017, the FCC held an incentive auction to repurpose a portion of the UHF TV spectrum to potential bidders. Okay, so the 600 megahertz UHF TV band was directly affected, specifically between 614 and 698 megahertz, so a 48 megahertz chunk was either auctioned off or reproportioned. So they called this the 600 megahertz plan. And so basically what this means, because this has been auctioned off, TV stations that were in that frequency range, if they're going to remain on the air, are going to be repackaged, which basically means moved from the 600 megahertz band down to a new channel below 608 megahertz. So this doesn't just impact 600 megahertz, this also impacts 500 megahertz because those TV stations will be moving. So who won the auction? So first of all, T-Mobile was the big winner. They got 45% of the 70 megahertz available spectrum nationwide. Other successful bidders include Dish, Comcast, AT&T, among others. The results vary by city, so this changes depending on what city you're in. And each auction winner has their own timeline for the use of the purchased spectrum. We want to note that T-Mobile, who won most of the spectrum, is being particularly aggressive, and we'll talk more about that later. All right, so in the 600 megahertz band plan, the auction again covers between 614 and 698, so that's basically, if we're talking in blocks, that's the C block, or block 24, 25, and 26. It's broken up into a few different chunks. So the first chunk we'll talk about is the guard band, which is a very teeny tiny chunk. That's 3 megahertz that separates the downlink band and radio astronomy. And yeah, so that's basically guarding radio astronomy and the downlink band from interfering with each other. So then if you look, we've got the downlink and the uplink band. So those, particularly with T-Mobile, we're looking at how data goes back and forth. So the downlink bands are for people to download things from the cell tower, and the uplink band is for people to upload things to the cell tower. And as you can see, the red indicates that's the area that was actually auctioned off, so none of that is going to be available anymore. And then we've got the Duplex Gap. So the Duplex Gap is the 11 megahertz between 652 and 663 megahertz, right in the middle of block 25, if we're talking about blocks. That separates the downlink and the uplink band. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Duplex Gap now. So, of 600 megahertz of what's been auctioned off, what is still usable? The only thing that's actually still usable is the Duplex Gap, which is that 11 megahertz chunk. So that's new information to us that we found out this week in a meeting with T-Mobile. We'd originally thought that the guard band was still accessible, though a small amount of it, but actually that is not true. So even the duplex gap has its limitations. So 1 megahertz of that, 652 to 653, is not usable. It's a buffer, so you cannot go in there. Between 653 and 657, there's 4 megahertz that's only available to people with a Part 74 license. And between 657 and 663, there's 6 megahertz that's available for unlicensed radio use and white space devices. Okay, and there are additional limitations in that the maximum power output that you can use is 20 milliwatts. So people that are broadcasting in 50, 100, 250 these days, to actually comply with the legal spec, you're going to need to be broadcasting at 20 milliwatts in those frequencies. All right, so if we take just a look at a little graphic for the duplex gap, you can see that the downlink is all the way to the left with the red, and then the uplink is all the way to the right with the band, and then you've got the duplex gap. The green is unavailable. The dark blue is for licensed use, and the light blue is for unlicensed use and white space devices. And also, just to be clear about white space devices, those are other things. It could be some new technology that hasn't come out yet, but that will also could potentially be crowding inside of that band. So it is definitely, we don't know what's going to be in there. And it could change because of white space devices, and it may be a little messy. Okay, so as we mentioned, only 400 megahertz is reserved for licensed users. There's no way to say, like, this frequency is mine. People operating in the same area need to coordinate locally. Even if you're a licensed user operating in the upper duplex gap, that's for the unlicensed portion of it, you're considered unlicensed. There's no priority in the unlicensed portion of the duplex gap, even for people with licenses. And the max power output for operating in the duplex gap is only 20 milliwatts. And so white space devices are actually licensed for 40 milliwatt usage, so they'll be able to use more than wireless microphones. Okay, so now, what's left is below 614 megahertz. So below 614 megahertz, we already know that part of that TV band 37, which is from 608 to 614, is allocated for radio astronomy and wireless medical telemetry service. And so these frequencies are unavailable. That's nothing new. We've never been able to use those before. But below that, between 470 and 608 megahertz, or TV channels 14 to 36, there's no change in the actual, in the ability to use wireless microphones or communication devices there. Okay. So in terms of timeline, so on July 13th of 2020 is the deadline for all users to relocate out of the affected 600 megahertz spectrum. So that includes TV stations, that includes wireless microphone users, comm users, etc. You got to be out of those stations 100%. TV stations are being repackaged, as mentioned before, from the 600 megahertz band into the 500 megahertz band, and some are moving out early. WOR here in New York City is expected to move this year, for instance. You may start running into interference prior to July 13th, 2020, as T-Mobile rolls out its 600 megahertz service. There are over 500 markets that are currently live, and T-Mobile provided us with a spreadsheet that you can click on, and they'll tell you what in your area is actually going live and what their tentative timeline is. So just to take a look at what that looks like, so we can see that in. This is basically what the spreadsheet looks like. So where their plans are. Check out that link to see what's going to be affected, what's going to affect you. All right. So also just to note, some people might think, oh well, maybe the coverage won't be all that strong. the base stations that T-Mobile's planning on rolling out can transmit it up to 1,000 watts. So when we're thinking about 1,000 watts versus 100 milliwatts, 1,000 watts wins. So those areas will, as soon as service goes live, those areas will not be useful anymore. Okay, so here are just a few graphics that I put together so you can see what what below 614, the usable spectrum, may look like in different cities. So you can see the green being open spectrum. The orange is being our things being repacked, TV stations that are moving from 600 into 500. Light blue is something that has not been confirmed as to where it's being repacked, but where we think it's going. And then white is an existing TV station. So if you look in New York City, we have what looks like we have about 6 channels of open RF still available. It looks like we've got 2 channels in block 19, or in A1, as you were to say, and then it looks like there are 4 channels in block B1, which would be block 21, and then 3 and 22. This is not 100% confirmed. This is what it may look like. And we did get this data from Radioactive Designs. Their website is below. So if you're not in New York City and you want to see what it may look like in your neighborhood, you can go to radioactiverf.com. And here's the same thing for LA. As you can see in LA, most of the open spectrum is in the lower block. So block 470, 19, 20, and 1 open channel in block 21. And then because I was just in Dallas, and I forgot to mention the great people of Dallas and Texas and the Southwest, was just there for a sound mixer. I got this sweet t-shirt from Vandalay Sound and this sweet glass from Vandalay Sound also. And then from some amazing bar, I got these great socks. I don't know if you can see my socks, but they're Texas socks. So I'm repping Texas. Thank you, Jack and Tyler. All right, so that being said, the reason I said that is because I also put that together for Dallas. And Dallas, granted, it's a little bit more spread out, so that's why you can see there's the different cities that are around Dallas. But Dallas, there looks like there's really only 2 confirmed channels of open UHF in the lower blocks down there. So again, this is what may happen. This is the data that we've had in terms of the repack. Not all of these stations are digital, so there may be portions of those stations that are available because analog doesn't take up the whole TV channel. But it's definitely going to get cozier. All right, so additional frequencies that have become available through this new FCC regulations. So 169 to 172 megahertz, just below VHF. They've also opened up the STL band a little bit further. So that's 941.5 to 960 megahertz, which is now open to all Part 74 licensees. And we'll talk about Part 74 in a minute. Then we go up into 1.4 and 1.5 gigahertz, which is shared with flight training. So you need to get different approval from the AFTRCC, which is the coordinating agency, and it's really intended for large venues for people who are using 100 or more microphones. And then you get way up in the spectrum, which is almost at 7 gigahertz in the upper 6 gigahertz range, which really, it's really only good for very short range applications. Okay, so in addition to this, there are additional transmission requirements. Wireless microphones transmitting below 614 megahertz sold or reblocked or serviced after October of 2018, that's this year, will need to conform to the ETSI standards for spectrum efficiency. So what that means is the size of the mask, which is how much bandwidth each transmitter takes up, will go from 75 kilohertz to 50 kilohertz. Which does 2 things. Number one, it'll make it possible for you to squeeze more frequencies into the same amount of spectrum. But anytime you use an FM, when you're doing FM transmission and you squeeze a signal into a smaller into a smaller bandwidth, you're also going to lose a little bit of audio information. You lose some of the dynamic range. So it may cause a higher noise floor in some products that are affected by this. And the way to solve that is just to boost your gain a little bit so you're getting more signal and less noise. So anything prior to that, any equipment bought or serviced before October of this year are exempt from those requirements as long as they're not interfering with licensed carrier operations. Okay, so now let's talk about Part 74 licensing. First of all, if you are working in the film and TV industry, you should get a Part 74 license. It will give you the ability to register for protected channels to prevent interference from white space devices. You also get the ability to transmit up to 250 milliwatts in any frequency below 608 megahertz, whereas if you're unlicensed, you're only able to do 50 milliwatts. This was previously only available to broadcasters, cable TV operators, and film and content providers, which is if you're working in the film and TV industry, that's where you would fall into it. But now sound professionals, companies, and venues who routinely use 50 mics are eligible. And you should know this is something that we're working on to help people fill out their Part 74 applications. This is a service that we'll be helping to provide, and we'll have more information soon. I will relate a brief story, is that the FCC is also not necessarily particularly clear on all of their regulations, and that we have had a customer call the FCC help desk and say, well, I'm not going to have 50 channels, you know, can I still do that? And the FCC help desk said no. So we have had additional conversations, and that's just not true. People working in film and TV, we fall under the category of content providers and are therefore eligible for Part 74. There's no minimum requirement for number of wireless microphones. You're just eligible. So it's something that you should get, you should look into getting, because it'll make your life a lot easier going forward. It also, the more Part 74 registered users that there are for potential future auctions, it gives us more of a say, because all of a sudden they know how many people there are, as opposed to just being this nebulous cloud of, yeah, maybe there's 10 people. You know, there's hundreds and thousands of us, so we should have our voices be heard. Okay, next. And what might be next? This is all pure speculation. None of this is confirmed, but there is the 700 megahertz spectrum went away about 8 years ago. So there's a potential for another auction of additional spectrum in 5 to 7 years. We don't know if that's going to be in 500 megahertz. We don't know if that's going to be in gigahertz. We have no idea where that could be. But it's purely speculative that the FCC could look to auction additional spectrum in 5 to 7 years from now. Some also view the use of 600 megahertz in devices like cell phones as a gateway for white space devices to be able to use 500 megahertz, which could cause further congestion. The idea being that instead of, let's say you were to walk inside a building, and instead of having Wi-Fi, they had some kind of white space device that transmitted data over 500 megahertz instead. Your phone, because the antennas are so similar to 600 megahertz, would be able to tap into that, and that potentially could congest the 500 megahertz spectrum further. So, what you can do, number one, register for a Part 74 license. That'll help so much. Opens up all of those other bands that we talked about. Number two, alternate technologies, wideband wireless systems giving you more options inside the same amount of spectrum. Use more efficient RF transmitters, as we talked about. The new ETSI specs are going to allow you to cram more things into a smaller spectrum. Using transmitters with integrated recorders or body pack recorders in line with your transmitters, and moving your IFB or camera transmitters into those alternate bands, into VHF bands, Comtech, Electro VHF, Zaxcom ERXs using 2.4. Manufacturers are also offering trade-ins. So a lot of manufacturers, if you have older items and you want to get something new, manufacturers are offering some money toward purchasing a new system for your old stuff. You can also reblock your existing wireless, so change what your current wireless do. So rather than buying something new in a lower block, you can take your old wireless system and move it into a lower frequency range. And then the other option is trying to sell your equipment overseas, because as of right now, the 600 megahertz option only affects the United States. So so Asia, India, Mexico, Canada, all those places would surely be happy to take the 600 megahertz stuff that you have off your hands. You should know that the market is kind of saturated right now for things in Block 26. But if you can find somebody to buy it, then you might be able to save a little bit of money. Anyway, so that's the presentation. So if you have any questions, please feel free to call us. Our number's on the screen. You can also email us at info@gothamsound.com. As this moves forward, again, the drop dead date is not until July of 2020. So as this moves forward, we'll be making update to this presentation or making new presentations. Any questions, Joey? Fantastic. Okay. So coming up soon on Gotham Sound. So we have on February 18th, we're having a tax seminar with Nancy Adams, who's a CPA in New York City. You will also be able to watch online live. You will also be able to watch online pre-record or afterwards, after it's recorded. However, you can, so you can register for tickets in person, or you can watch it live on TV. So as always, for this video and more, you can visit our archives at gothamsound.tv, and you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter for all the latest news. If you have any ideas or questions and ideas in terms of what you'd like to see on a future live stream, please email us at info@gothamsound.com. And thank you very much for watching.